The sky does not turn black instantly, it bruises. A deep, sickly violet spreads across the horizon, as the protective blanket of nitrogen and oxygen vanishes into the vacuum of space. The pressure that has held our bodies together since the dawn of our species, simply ceases to exist. Within milliseconds, the internal gases of every living organism begin to expand violently. The air inside the lungs, suddenly having no external force to counter it, swells against the delicate alveolar walls. It is a silent, internal rupture. The skin does not burst, but it stretches, becoming taut and distorted, as water molecules within the soft tissues turn into vapor. This is the boiling of the blood, not from heat, but from the raw physics of a zero-pressure environment. We are no longer inhabitants of a protected garden, we are suddenly, terrifyingly, exposed to the naked mechanics of the cosmos. Every window in every skyscraper across the globe shatters outward, propelled by the internal pressure of the buildings. The sound is not a roar, because sound requires a medium to travel through. It is a muffled, bone-conducting vibration felt in the chest and the jaw, a thud of a world losing its breath. This is the end. But to understand why, we must rewind to the beginning. We exist at the bottom of a massive, invisible ocean. This ocean is our atmosphere, a complex layering of gases that exerts a constant pressure of 101.3 kilopascals upon every square centimeter of our skin. We do not feel it because we evolved beneath it, our internal pressures perfectly calibrated to match the weight of the air above us. This gaseous envelope is held in place by gravity, a delicate balance of thermal energy and planetary pull that has remained stable for billions of years. It provides more than just the oxygen we breathe, it is a shield, a heat sink, and a structural support system for the very biology of Earth. The troposphere, extending approximately 12 kilometers upward, contains 80% of the atmosphere's mass. Above it, the stratosphere, mesosphere, and thermosphere act as successive layers of armor against the relentless radiation of the sun and the freezing void of the interstellar medium. This air governs the boiling point of water, the flight of birds, and the propagation of sound. It is the medium through which we communicate and the reason the sky appears blue rather than a haunting, endless black. To remove it, even for a duration as brief as 5 seconds, is to pull the foundation out from under the temple of life. We take for granted the sheer weight of the air, yet it is the only thing preventing our bodily fluids from turning into gas. As the clock hits the zero mark, the transition is instantaneous. The 5-second countdown to a global vacuum begins. In the first millisecond, the most immediate effect is the total disappearance of sound. Sound is a mechanical wave, a vibration of molecules. Without the air to carry these vibrations, the world falls into an absolute, terrifying silence. A jet engine screaming at full throttle becomes a ghost, a falling hammer hits the ground with no more than a phantom thud transmitted through the soles of your shoes. The sky loses its blue scattering. Because there are no molecules to deflect the shorter wavelengths of sunlight, the sky turns into a pitch-black abyss, even while the sun itself burns with a new, terrifying intensity. Without the filtering effect of the ozone layer and the dense air, raw ultraviolet radiation slams into the surface of the planet. Every exposed patch of skin begins to burn instantly, not from fire, but from the high-energy photons of the sun that are no longer being blocked. The solar radiation is so intense that it begins to bleach the colors of the world in seconds. By the end of the first second, the physical structural integrity of the planet's surface begins to fail. The air trapped within the soil, within the cracks of the pavement, and within the hulls of ships expands with explosive force. Small pockets of air under the ground burst upward, creating miniature craters of dust and debris. The oceans do not simply sit still, the surface of every lake, river, and sea begins to boil violently. This is not the boiling of a kettle, where heat drives the phase change. This is cold boiling. At zero pressure, the boiling point of water drops below the ambient temperature of the liquid. The surface of the Pacific Ocean erupts into a frantic, foaming mist as the water turns into vapor, seeking to fill the void where the atmosphere used to be. This creates a thick, rising fog of steam that obscures the view of the now black sky. In the second, the biological consequences reach a critical threshold. Any human or animal that attempts to hold their breath is facing immediate internal trauma. The lungs, filled with air at sea level pressure, act like overinflated balloons in a vacuum. The pressure differential is so great that the delicate lung tissue tears, and air is forced into the bloodstream, causing massive embolisms. For those who exhale, the transition is slightly less violent but no less certain. The oxygen in the blood begins to diffuse backward, moving from the oxygen-rich blood into the empty lungs to be expelled into the void. This is a process of rapid deoxygenation. The brain, deprived of its fuel, begins to shut down the peripheral systems. Vision blurs as the pressure within the eyeballs fluctuates, distorting the shape of the lens. The tongue and the throat feel a strange, bubbling sensation as the saliva begins to vaporize, cooling the mouth rapidly through the process of evaporative freezing. By the third second, the mechanical world has descended into chaos. Every combustion engine on the planet dies simultaneously. Cars on highways, planes in the sky, and massive cargo ships on the ocean cease to function. A fire requires three things: fuel, heat, and an oxidizer. Without the oxygen of the atmosphere, every flame on Earth is snuffed out in a heartbeat. The blue flame of a gas stove, the roaring fires of an industrial furnace, and the engines of a Boeing 747 all vanish. The planes, however, face a much more immediate threat than engine failure. Aviation relies on lift, which is generated by the movement of air over wings. Without air, there is no lift. Every aircraft currently in flight begins to fall as if they were made of lead. They do not glide, they tumble. The airfoils become useless slabs of metal in a vacuum. Hundreds of thousands of tons of machinery begin a terminal descent toward the surface, while inside the cabins, the sudden decompression has likely caused the fuselages to buckle or burst. Most turn away from the void. But here at Velastrix, we decode the math behind the chaos. Join the archive by subscribing now. In the fourth second, the scale of the disaster reaches the geological. The sudden removal of the atmosphere means the removal of nearly 10 tons of pressure from every square meter of the Earth's surface. The crust of the Earth is elastic to a small degree, and this massive, sudden unloading causes a global seismic shiver. It is a minute but detectable expansion of the planet's surface. In urban centers, the effect is catastrophic. The seals in every sealed environment, from high-tech laboratories to simple refrigerators, fail. Tires on vehicles explode with the force of small grenades, sending shards of rubber and metal through the silent, airless streets. The dust of the world, no longer held down by air pressure or moved by winds, begins to behave strangely. Every step taken on the ground kicks up a plume of dust that falls back in a perfect parabolic arc, exactly like the dust on the moon, because there is no air resistance to slow its fall or make it drift. By the fifth second, the silence has become a heavy, physical weight. The world is an erasure of frozen motion. Birds have fallen from the sky, their wings flapping uselessly against the vacuum. The leaves on trees have gone limp as the internal moisture of the plant cells begins to vaporize, causing the cellular structure to collapse. The darkness of the sky, the boiling of the seas, and the silent falling of the world's aircraft create a tableau of absolute cosmic horror. The human body is now in a state of advanced hypoxia. While the heart may still be beating, the blood it pumps is a foamy, oxygen-depleted slurry. Consciousness is fading into a gray haze. The heat of the sun, no longer diffused by the air, bakes one side of every object to scorching temperatures, while the shadows fall into a deep, cryogenic chill. There is no wind to move the heat, no convection to balance the scales. The world is a place of extremes, a skeletal version of the Earth we knew. Then, at the conclusion of the fifth second, the atmosphere returns. It does not return gently. The vacuum of the world is a giant, planet-sized hole that the air rushes back to fill. This is the greatest sonic boom in the history of the Earth. The air rushes inward from the upper reaches of the exosphere and from the pressurized pockets that survived, colliding with the surface at supersonic speeds. This is a planetary-scale compression event. The sound is loud enough to deafen any biological life that has survived the vacuum. The sudden repressurization slams into the heaving oceans, the crumbling buildings, and the gasping lungs of every living creature. The kinetic energy of the returning air is converted into a massive pulse of heat. For a moment, the temperature of the air spikes as it is compressed, a wall of heat following the wall of sound. The oceans, which had been boiling in the vacuum, are suddenly hammered back down by the weight of a quadrillion tons of air. This creates massive, chaotic tsunamis that radiate outward from every point of impact. The aircraft that were falling find air beneath their wings again, but the transition is so violent and the turbulence so extreme that many are torn apart by the sudden structural loading. The cars that had coasted to a stop are buffeted by the returning winds, which reach speeds of hundreds of kilometers per hour as the pressure stabilizes. The dust that was settling is kicked back into the sky in a global shroud, blocking out the sun that had just been so blindingly bright. In the minutes following the return, the world is a landscape of shattered glass, stalled engines, and profound trauma. The biological toll is staggering. While the 5-second window was short enough that some might survive if they had exhaled and were in a sheltered environment, the vast majority of the biosphere would be in a state of shock or cessation. The damage to the lungs, the eardrums, and the circulatory systems of the planet's inhabitants would be universal. The thermal shock of the re-entry would have ignited dry vegetation in some areas, while the sudden pressure changes would have caused structural failures in even the strongest dams and bridges. This thought experiment reveals the fragility of our existence. We live within a narrow band of physical parameters, protected by a thin layer of gas that we rarely acknowledge. The atmosphere is not just something we breathe, it is the structural framework of our reality. It keeps our blood liquid, our planes in the sky, and the silence of the void at bay. Without it, the laws of physics that govern our daily lives are replaced by the cold, indifferent mechanics of deep space. We are travelers on a pressurized vessel called Earth, and the hull is made of nothing more than gravity and gas. To explore the impossible and visualize the unknown, subscribe to Velastrix.